Howdy Commanders, Echo here. Today we're going to take a look at some tips that you can employ to help you land more torpedoes. This is going to be primarily a destroyer-based conversation, although some of the tips can be applied to the cruisers that have torpedoes in this game. Basically none of it's going to be relevant to the battleships that have torpedoes, but in general this will be focused primarily on destroyers. The game in the background is going to be in that Tier 6 premium French destroyer, the Torpedoes. We're divisioned up with Shadow, and he's in the Belfast, and Terra in his Gneisenau. We're on Crash Zone. It's the 3 neutral cap configuration for this map. We are in the northeast spawn, or the Charlie spawn, and we are punching down to 5. So before we get into tips for landing more torpedoes on target, we're going to first discuss why you would even care about landing torpedoes and why that's important. Now, to be fair, temper this with the fact that landing torpedoes on ships is one of the kind of bottom tier priorities for a destroyer. It's one of the roles that the destroyer plays that is less important, but nonetheless it is still a critical component of destroyer play, and to have really successful games consistently where you're contributing to your team in that damage output type of role, you do need to land a lot of your torpedoes. Yes, this is not the primary role of a destroyer in most games, but in some games it can be the role that you need to fill in order to make sure that your team clinches the victory. So it is important to talk about ways to land torpedoes. The first reason that it's important to land your torps on target is that on average, a given torpedo, tier for tier, line to line, has a higher maximum damage than a comparable battleship AP shell citadel damage. Now yes, there are things like torpedo belt protection and damage saturation to the various sections of the ship, but those things are sort of similar to getting like just a regular penetration compared to a citadel, or like over pens compared to a citadel. So it's kind of balances out between, you know, your various torpedo hits compared to battleship hits. So on any given strike, on any given shell hit compared to a given torpedo hit, the torpedo will do more damage hit for hit compared to those battleship AP shells. The second reason it's important to land torpedoes on target is for that flood chance. Floods slow ships down, literally decreases their maximum speed and their acceleration rate. It forces out damage con because almost nobody wants to be subjected to a flood, so they hit that damage con pretty readily. Or if they don't have a damage con on tap, then the flood damage is catastrophic and can often put ships on the bottom. Third reason it's important to land torps on target is for that module knockout potential. You can take out rudders and you can take out engines, leaving ships more vulnerable to follow-up torps or to gunfire from either you or friendlies. Fourth reason it's important to land torps on target is that they do huge chunk damage. It's large like Alpha Strike, boom, huge hits or huge punches, leaving ships often easy to finish off with either your guns or friendlies' guns, or maybe follow-up torps from friendlies as well. And you know, it kind of sets these battleships or even cruisers that you're hitting with torpedoes up to be easily finished off later on in the game. And lastly, tying into that, is that huge chunk damage can often change the way the enemy plays. You know, if you're playing wounded, you have to employ a different strategy. You're often less able to be aggressive. You have to play a little more reserved, or, you know, further back, hang back. You're less aggressive towards the caps, etc. And once you've landed a torp or two on somebody, it shows them that you're pretty dangerous and you can be effective with those torpedoes. You've kind of got that guy's number, if you will, and you're not to be trifled with. So how do you actually land more torpedoes? Well, tip number 1 is to spec for it. Build your commander and build your ship to land more torpedoes and be more effective with them. Use torpedo boat captains when it's appropriate. Commanders like Tanaka, Abonyu, and Von Spee. I would recommend staying away from Tirret because I think Vian is better for the UK DDs, but those other 3 guys are a definite way to go. Slot in Azure Lane Natago as an inspiration, and slot in Bay as an inspiration. Set up your skill selections for the Torpedoes. Subsurface Venture, Fragile Threat, Torpedo Safari, or back in stock. It's kind of a wash between those two, and it depends boat to boat whether you need more range on those torps or you need them to reload faster, but either one of those are pretty good choices in most times. And your ship modules, take aiming systems for the turret, torpedo, traverse, concealment systems for the same reason you slot in bay, and on those upper tier destroyers, torpedo reload module in slot 4. Way number 2 to land more torpedoes is to use narrow spread. Please use narrow spread. Unless you're on the reds, of course, and you're shooting at me. Then please, by all means, use widespread. Widespread, imagine if you were looking at a battleship commander and he had a skill that just said, increase your dispersion by 50%. And it was red, obviously, increasing, making it worse. Make your dispersion 50% worse. And you just didn't get any benefit out of it. And that's all the skill was. And then you clicked on it. That's functionally the same thing as using widespread torps. Just don't use widespread torps. Tip number 3 is to get up close. This is why we talked about slotting in a bay inspiration and concealment module. By getting in close, it keeps your cone of your torpedo spread as tight as possible, those torpedoes as close together to each other as possible when they reach the target. Launching them when that target is as close to your blue ring as you're comfortable with guarantees that those torps are tight in together. Imagine like a shotgun spread pattern when you're using some kind of multi-projectile shot. The further out you are away from the target, the more that shot pattern spreads out, the fewer of those pellets or shots are going to hit that target. You want to be as close in as possible, keeping that spread tight, ensuring that you land as many torps as you possibly can. You do this by getting in close. Tip number 4 is to launch your torps on cooldown, or at least as close to cooldown as possible. You can't land them if you don't launch them. Obviously, there are situations where you don't have a target or you have to wait to get around an island, but if you have a fairly viable target and you don't anticipate having a more viable target in the very near future, go ahead and launch those torps. You can't land them if you don't launch them. Tip number 5 is to try to set yourself up to launch torpedoes at the enemy's broadside. Just like when you're shooting it with AP from a heavy cruiser or a battleship, you want to try to launch your torpedoes into their side. It's much harder to land torpedoes, especially multiple torpedoes, when you're launching at a target that's coming bow in or especially running away from you towards their stern. Tip number 6 is to look for battleships and, to a lesser extent, other ships, but in particular BBs, that are pinned between you and an island. This gives them basically nowhere to run, if you will, once those torpedoes get detected and they've got no choice. What are they going to do? Turn into the island and ground themselves and take the torps anyway, and now they're beached as well? They probably won't have much time to react and turn into the torps either, so you want to try to look for positions where they're pinned up against the island. Tip number 7 is to launch torps near the target and then further from the target. What this means is when you're launching them, watch like the direction of travel of the target. So you launch your first set of spreads. This is assuming, of course, that you have multiple launchers to launch roughly at the same time. So if you've got 2 or even 3 launchers to send out at basically the same time, shoot closer to the target's bow and then further from the target's bow with your second or third launches. This means that as that target continues travel, they're going to run into your first spread, and then they're going to run into your second spread, and they're going to take maybe 1 or 2 from that first spread, and then another 1 or 2 from that second spread. Tip number 8 is to look for target-rich environments, and we've actually got an example of this coming up relatively soon, so keep an eye on it. Try to look for situations where there's multiple targets in roughly the same part of the map, and you can kind of flip back and forth between the 2 or 3 of them, if it looks like, oh, maybe these guys are roughly on the same path, and then use your target indicator to see like, oh, these guys are roughly in the same spot. See, I just did it right there. Battleship was, on one path, and the indicator put it at one spot, and then the cruiser was on roughly the same spot. So if those guys change their trajectories or speed or rudder just a little bit, they might end up taking the spread that was launched at the other guy, or vice versa. Tip number 9 is to use your torpedo aim indicator for a while to give you some data. It can often be beneficial to keep your torpedo aim indicator on a guy for an extended period of time to kind of gather some data. Maybe see if he's playing with the throttle or playing with the rudder. Maybe he's thinking, I'm going to come on the far side of this island instead of the near side. And you see him start to turn his rudder. Or, maybe he's slowing down because he's going to smoke up or something like that. If you don't have a reason to keep your guns up and you're not anticipating needing to shoot anytime soon, it can often be beneficial to just play with your torpedo aim indicator up instead of having your guns at the ready. Tip number 10 is to stay out of cap circles, don't throw your smoke down, don't get spotted, etc. This can keep you concealed, make the targets unaware of your location, kind of lull them into a false sense of security, like, oh, there's no DD around here, whatever. They kind of lose track of you, they're not thinking about you, and that can often lead to a higher percentage chance of landing your torpedoes. Or, kind of tip number 10B, is to intentionally do those things. If you've launched torps and it looks like they might not hit, sometimes it can actually be beneficial to kind of trick those guys into doing something that will cause those torps to land, like going into a cap circle and giving your position away, smoking up and giving your position away, shooting and giving your position away, etc. Sometimes it can actually lead to more torpedo hits by getting yourself spotted. And lastly, a quick note on target selection. Much like with your guns, it's sometimes better to pick out a more opportune target. This is things like Tier 5 battleships that do not have that Slot 3 target acquisition module. Ships that are less likely to be running a brawler perk, like American battleships, for example. Most people run sims. Ships that don't have a plane, or that for sure do not have a plane up in the air. Ships that do not have sonar, or that for sure their sonar is on cooldown. Ships that don't have anyone else out in front of them, between you and them, that could screen for those torps. Ships that are in or behind smoke screens, as those smokes conceal the incoming torps. And ships that just in general are more slow and lumbering and harder to control, so that when they do spot those torpedoes, it's basically impossible for them to get out of the way. So in that game there, using those tips and strategies, we launched 33 torpedoes, landed 9 of them for an accuracy of 27.3%. And when you consider that 6 of them were sort of preemptive blind launches into a cap, and 6 more of them were at a low health cruiser that was probably going to die before they got there, that accuracy is even higher. And at the same time, we did our job by scouting for our team. We got 1 cap assist. We gunned down a low health enemy cruiser at the end of the game to finish it off, and we took top of the leaderboard. So you can still do your main jobs as a destroyer, employ these strategies, land a lot of torps to set your team up for success. Well, let me know in the comments below which of these strategies you're using, and if you have any ideas for any more tips on how to land more torpedoes. Thanks an awful lot for listening, everyone. I greatly appreciate it. And as always, stay salty, Commanders.